He left me penniless after the divorce. Then my 10-year-old revealed the truth. Julia Perkins had always been the kind of woman who moved quietly through life, unnoticed by most, yet holding steady in her commitments. At 38, she balanced the humdrum of bookkeeping with the endless demands of motherhood, raising her 10-year-old son, Miles, in the modest home they shared on the outskirts of Santa Rosa. When her 15-year marriage crumbled, fractured by secrets and quiet betrayals, she thought the worst had passed. She was wrong. The morning was gray and chilly as Julia pulled into the parking lot of the local supermarket, the one she'd shopped at since Miles was a baby. Exhausted from juggling early work shifts and school drop-offs, she clutched the worn leather purse that held not only her car keys, but the last threads of her independence. The recent divorce had drained her savings faster than she could tally, and rent hung over her head like a dark cloud. Inside the store, the familiar fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an impersonal glow on the narrow aisles. Julia's fingers trembled slightly as she selected essentials: vegetables, bread, and a carton of milk, the staples that could stretch a week. Miles, trailing close behind, scanned the shelves with the innocent curiosity only children possess, occasionally reaching for colorful cereal boxes, but quickly pulling back, as if sensing the tension surrounding their dwindling household funds. At the checkout, Julia meticulously arranged her items on the conveyor belt, avoiding eye contact with the cashier, a teenage girl with tired eyes and smudged eyeliner, who scanned the groceries with automatic movements. When Julia finally swiped her debit card, the machine blinked red. Transaction declined. A sharp silence froze the space between them. Julia's breath hitched, pencil-thin lips tightening as warmth crept up her neck, threatening to spill over into a flush of shame. Behind the counter, the cashier glanced toward the small line of waiting customers, biting her lip to suppress a sympathetic sigh. The man behind Julia shifted his feet impatiently, shooting a glance that pierced deeper than any words. I can come back with cash," Julia stammered, cheeks burning. Her voice was low but steady, trying to cloak the storm building inside her. Miles tugged her sleeve, whispering, "Mom, it's okay." But his small face betrayed a mix of confusion and embarrassment, his brows knit tight as he looked away. Julia forced a smile, but it was brittle, fracturing the moment she stepped back, leaving groceries and dreams on the conveyor. Each step toward the exit echoed her sinking spirit. The autumn air outside bit at her cheeks, but inside, the real chill was the fracture in her world, the feeling of being invisible, yet brutally exposed, judged by circumstances she couldn't control. She paused by her car, catching Miles' gaze. His wide eyes held something fierce beneath the surface, a flicker of loyalty hardening into quiet resolve. Julia squeezed his shoulder gently, feeling the tremors beneath her own. As she started the engine, the image of Greg, the man who had left her to navigate this maze of bills, legal stonewalls, and empty threats, flashed through her mind. What was he telling people? Did he know how small and powerless she felt in moments like this? In that instant, that sting of humiliation burned just enough to ignite something else, a stubborn ember of defiance. Whatever lay ahead, Julia knew she couldn't let this be her story's final chapter. The weight of a mother's love pressed on her heart, whispering promise through the quiet pain. Miles needed more than groceries today. He needed hope. And maybe, just maybe, Julia was ready to find hers. The schoolyard buzzed with the mingling sounds of laughter, the thud of basketballs against concrete, and the low murmur of parents gathering beneath a bright blue sky. It was fundraiser day, an event Julia had once looked forward to with quiet enthusiasm, but this year it weighed on her like a stone strapped to her chest. Clutching a few loose coins, she tried to blend into the background, eyes darting as though searching the faces around her for some sign of relief or kindness. Miles tugged at her hand, his small fingers curling around hers as they approached a booth where raffle tickets were being sold. His eager smile faltered when he spotted Greg approaching with the woman Julia had learned was named Vanessa. Greg's presence was magnetic, He moved with the loud confidence of someone used to being the center of attention. Vanessa's red blouse caught the sun, her designer heels clicking deliberately on the pavement as she turned to shoot Julia a pointed, mocking glance. Greg crouched down in front of Miles, tousling his son's hair in a practiced, affectionate gesture. "Hey, champ," he said, pulling a thick stack of crisp $100 bills from his wallet. "Here's something to help with the fundraiser." Miles' eyes lit up, and for a moment, Julia's heart clenched with a confusing mix of pride and pain. She watched as Miles carefully tucked the bills into his pocket, unaware of the storm around him. Julia gathered her courage and stepped forward, reaching into her worn purse. She pulled out the few coins she had managed to save, small, jangling change that could barely cover the cost of a couple raffle tickets. As she laid the coins on the table, the PTA president's narrowed eyes landed on her. A whispered exchange between two nearby mothers caught Julia's attention. "I don't know how she manages," one hissed quietly. "Seems irresponsible, doesn't she?" Vanessa brushed past Julia with a smirk, the sharp scent of her perfume lingering like a challenge. "Try to keep up," she said coolly before disappearing into the crowd. Julia's skin prickled with humiliation. She caught Miles' eyes, searching for anything but the confusion and disappointment that she felt rising in his gaze. "It's okay, Mom," he whispered, voice sounding small where others could hear. Julia's throat tightened. "No, it's not," she replied softly, managing a smile that felt brittle as glass. "But we'll get through this, together." As they walked away, Julia felt the layers of judgment weighing heavier on her shoulders. She could hear the faint hum of whispered conversations trailing behind them, and though no one spoke directly, their looks and murmurs cut just as deep. The sunny afternoon had turned cold, the warmth of the fundraiser eclipsed by the chill of social exile. Her mind raced, replaying every glance and word. How had it come to this? Greg's carefully crafted charm was turning the community against her, painting her as the incapable mother while he played the doting father. But Julia was determined not to let the whispers define her or her son's future. In the quiet moments that followed, as Miles clutched his tickets and looked up at her with a hint of hope, Julia wondered, how many other women felt the sting of this kind of silent judgment, and more importantly, how many had the strength to fight back? A slow calm began to settle over her shoulders with that thought, a soft whisper beneath the disgrace that day had brought. Perhaps this was only another test, a call to rise not just for herself, but for every quiet woman shadowed in doubt. Would courage be enough to turn the tide? Julia didn't know yet, but her son's bright eyes reminded her she couldn't afford not to try. Julia sat in the dim corner of her tiny living room, the soft hum of the old ceiling fan barely cutting through the thick, restless silence. Piles of rejection letters and job listings lay scattered across the coffee table, their impersonal typefaces mocking her efforts. Each application sent, each carefully crafted resume mailed, had so far been met with cold silence or polite refusals. The few calls she had received led only to bureaucratic dead ends, interviews that ended with vague promises and averted eyes. Her fingers traced the edge of a thin envelope from the courthouse, another denied petition to revisit the divorce settlement. The legal jargon inside was dense with procedural dismissals. Greg's tangled web of lawyers and hidden finances was stronger than she dared imagine. Every attempt to claw back what was rightfully hers was smothered under piles of paperwork and court dates she couldn't afford to miss. Let alone win. Miles was in his room, the faint sound of his homework scribbles reaching her ears. Lately, he seemed distant, quieter than usual, a small shadow of worry darkening the boy who once clung so tightly to her side. Julia's heart clenched. The weight of their shared uncertainty pressed on her chest, stubborn as a stone. She wanted to shield him from the storm of their reality, but the cracks were becoming too wide. One evening, after a long day filled with calls to temp agencies and hours scouring online postings, Julia sat at her dining table, with spreadsheets open on her laptop. That's when she noticed it, a small irregularity buried deep in Greg's business filings, something that didn't add up. a modest but suspicious discrepancy in reported income, a line item that seemed out of place. Her pulse quickened. It was the first real thread she'd found in the tangled mess he'd staged since their separation. Excitement sparked briefly, but with it came doubt. Who would believe her? Greg was well known in their community, polished and persuasive. Meanwhile, Julia was the strained ex-wife, fighting for scraps amid whispers and glances. The thought of confronting him, or worse, the courts, with shaky evidence was terrifying. Still, hope flared inside her like a fragile candle. Holding this clue felt like a lifeline, a chance to tip the scales, even if just a little. She tucked the documents away, running through plans in her mind. Talk to her lawyer, gather more proof, prepare for the fight. Days blurred into nights, filled with silent vigil. Julia noticed Miles's furtive glances, his fingers nervously twining and untwining as he kept to himself more than before. She caught him several times slipping out of the room during phone calls or meetings. His expression guarded and distant. The boy who once sought comfort in her arms now wore a quiet secret behind his eyes. Julia realized the battle was no longer hers alone. Tension hung thick between them, skirting the edges of their home like an uninvited guest. Yet beneath his silence, she sensed Miles's unwavering loyalty, a small comfort amid the growing storm. With every setback, her resolve hardened. She was more than the whispers, the empty bank accounts, the cold legal refusals. She was a mother, a fighter, someone who refused to vanish quietly. But doubt crept in ever more insistently. Would this faint hope, this tiny discrepancy, be enough to reclaim what she deserved? Or was it just a flicker doomed to flicker out in the gathering darkness? Julia didn't know. All she could do was hold on tight to that fragile light and keep moving forward. The day the tow truck rolled away with Julia's car was the day everything unraveled in a way she never imagined possible. It was a bright, unseasonably warm afternoon, the kind that usually lifted spirits and invited casual conversations on school playgrounds. But for Julia, the sun burned harsh and unforgiving as she stood frozen on the cracked asphalt of the school parking lot, surrounded by a crowd that seemed to grow larger by the minute. The beeping of the truck's reversing sensors was deafening to her ears, each beep punctuating the humiliation that tightened in her chest like a vice. Her car, that weathered blue Corolla she'd leaned on through late nights and early mornings, was being loaded onto the flatbed, right there, in front of the same parents she recognized from school plays and parent-teacher meetings. Mothers adjusted their pearl necklaces in tight purses. Fathers exchanged sideways glances. No words spoken, but the judgment sharp enough to cut. Julia's cheeks burned hotter as whispers rippled through the crowd. "I didn't know she was struggling so badly," one mother commented, voice low but laced with disbelief. "It's no wonder Greg wanted out." Someone else laughed softly. "I heard she's been asking for help at the food bank." Eyes, cold and accusatory, flicked toward Julia, and then to Miles, who stood at her side, clutching a crumpled baseball glove, his small frame overwhelmed by the crowd. Miles looked up at her, his usual bright eyes huddled beneath furrowed brows. Julia's heart cracked. She kneeled beside him, pressing her hands gently on his shoulders, but there was no shielding him from the stares, no hiding the silent stories being spun about a mother failing to keep her family afloat. The shoves of gossip and the weight of whispered ridicule hit harder than any harsh word. Dragging the last of her dignity with her, Julia accepted the plastic bags of donated groceries from a sympathetic volunteer at the school's small pantry, the shame slicing through her like an icy wind. She held the wobbly bags of canned vegetables and boxed pasta tightly, feeling their cold edges press against her worn fingers. The realization was sharp and unbearable. She had become a sad spectacle, fodder for the community's rumor mill, the subject of hushed conversations as she walked past. That night, alone in their cramped apartment, Julia sat at the small kitchen table, the overhead bulb casting hard shadows on the peeling wallpaper. Miles, unusually quiet, lingered nearby. Something had shifted in him. He seemed to sense the depths of the pain, but kept his feelings carefully guarded. Hours later, when Julia washed dishes in silence, she noticed Miles peering at her from the doorway, eyes shining with a mix of concern and something new, an unexpected maturity. He didn't speak, but his presence was charged with an unspoken promise. For the first time in days, Julia felt the faintest stir of hope, not from herself, but from her son, who, despite everything, seemed ready to stand a little taller beside her. Could they survive this? Could humiliation be the thread that wove them closer instead of tearing them apart? The questions haunted her, but beneath the despair, a quiet spark flickered. Whatever came next, Julia wondered, maybe they were ready to face it together. And maybe life still held a chance for redemption. Julia sat alone at the kitchen table, the pale glow of the single lamp casting long shadows across the cluttered surface. The scattered papers bore the faint outlines of hastily scribbled notes and printouts, evidence she was piecing together in a desperate puzzle. Her head ached, but exhaustion was secondary to the flicker of hope ignited by something she'd unearthed. Miles hovered nearby, unusually quiet, his small frame tense as if holding a secret just out of reach. Julia glanced up from the papers, searching his face and catching the tight set of his jaw, the way he clutched his worn backpack straps. Her mother's instincts reached through the silence like warm fingers. She knew something had changed, something she couldn't quite put into words. "Miles?" she ventured carefully. He hesitated, then ducked his head, voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, I found something." Julia's heart skipped. She motioned him closer, moving aside a legal brief. "What is it? You can tell me anything." His small hands pushed a folded envelope across the table. Inside were papers and a few USB drives, the kind used for storing data. Julia's pulse quickened as she recognized some of the documents immediately. Financial sheets, transaction records, spreadsheets filled with numbers she hadn't seen before. "Where did you get this?" Her voice was steady, but inside, a storm of relief mixed with fear churned. Miles glanced toward the kitchen window, the shadowed edges where his father's car often waited on weekends. "When Dad picks me up, I've been watching. Sometimes he leaves things in his office or on his desk. I took pictures once, and I made copies of some files when he wasn't looking." Julia's mind spun. Greg had been careless, trusting a boy to keep quiet, underestimating the fierce loyalty between mother and son. Here, right before her, was the first real crack in the perfect facade Greg had built to cover his deceit. "But Miles, this is dangerous," she warned gently, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "You shouldn't have done this alone." He looked up, eyes wide with seriousness, far beyond his years. "I wanted to help. I can't stand seeing you sad and tired all the time. You don't deserve this." A lump caught in Julia's throat. The weight of her son's quiet bravery shone in the dim light. The pieces were finally beginning to fit. The errors in Greg's business filings, the walls of silence Julia met at every door, the strange distance growing between her and Miles. Now they had something real. Julia straightened, the exhaustion melting into a fiery determination. This truth, hidden deep beneath numbers and false claims, was their weapon. She would use this, the evidence Miles had risked so much to bring her, to fight back. "We're going to show this to my lawyer," Julia promised. "And we're going to make sure nobody ever gets to hurt us again." Miles nodded, a quiet smile breaking through the tension. Together they would face whatever came next, not as victims, but as unstoppable allies. And Julia knew, no matter the battles ahead, this discovery marked the turning point where hope would begin to take root. Under the flickering fluorescent light of her cramped living room, Julia sat surrounded by a spread of papers and folders, her fingers trembling as she carefully sifted through each document Miles had bravely brought to her. The house was quiet, except for the soft rustle of paper and the faint buzz of the old refrigerator humming in the kitchen. Her heart pounded with a blend of dread and determination. This was it, the moment that could change everything. The files told a damning story. Line after line of financial records revealed how Greg had manipulated the books, declaring less income than reality, funneling assets into offshore accounts she'd never known existed. The evidence was undeniable, a labyrinth of falsified statements and fabricated expenses that rewrote the truth of his wealth. Julia's usually steady hands shook slightly as she reached for her phone, calling her lawyer with a voice stronger than she felt. "Linda," Julia said, her voice tight but resolute, "I've got something. Real proof. Greg's been hiding money for years. The divorce settlement was based on lies." Linda's gravity-filled pause on the other end was sudden, then firm. "This changes everything. We'll file the motions immediately. The court won't ignore this." Outside, the sleepy town of Santa Rosa moved on unaware, but inside, a storm was about to break. Within days, the tide began to turn. Julia's lawyer presented the evidence, the judge's eyes narrowing as the truth unfurled in the sterile courtroom. Greg, once confident and untouchable, crumbled behind his neatly tailored suit. His once bright smile faded under the weight of his deceit exposed. The supportive whispers of Vanessa, his new girlfriend, faltered too, and she vanished from the community as quickly as she had arrived, her cruel smirk replaced by awkward silence. News spread, first quietly, then with growing momentum, as neighbors who had doubted Julia now watched in astonishment. The town's perception shifted palpably from cold judgment to cautious respect. Julia herself found a quiet satisfaction in this turn, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the battle was far from over. At home, Miles beamed for the first time in months, his loyalty rewarded in the most tangible way. Julia hugged him close, feeling the tremor of triumph mingled with exhaustion. "We did it," she whispered, tears blurring the edge of her vision. Yet even as justice was served, Julia's victory was not just legal, it was deeply personal. She had reclaimed her dignity, her voice, and her future. As she looked ahead, a quiet question lingered. How many other women silenced by lies might find their own hidden truths? The fight for justice was far-reaching, and Julia knew her story had just begun to inspire. Could the strength born of adversity ripple beyond her small world? She dared to hope, and with Miles by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next. The gymnasium buzzed with undercurrents of anticipation and whispered apologies as Julia stepped through the double doors of the next school event. The familiar hum of children's laughter and the clatter of plastic chairs felt different this time. Charged with an energy that hummed beneath the veneer of polite smiles and tentative nods. Julia's posture was unshakable now, a quiet strength radiating from her unwavering gaze. Gone was the hesitant woman huddling behind worn groceries and whispered rumors. Instead, she carried herself with the solid confidence of someone who had weathered storms and found something precious beneath the wreckage. Her voice. Parents who once exchanged sidelong glances now approached her with genuine warmth. "Julia, I'm so sorry I judged you," murmured a mother she'd seen snub her weeks before, her eyes sincere and apologetic. "It was unfair." Another joined in, a father whose nod spoke volumes beyond words. Slowly, the community that had doubted her began to gather around, each gesture knitting a fragile web of support. Across the room, Greg's presence was diminished, stripped of his usual swagger and charm. His face, once smug and untouchable, was drawn tight with the weight of consequences he could no longer evade. His new girlfriend was nowhere in sight, disappeared like a ghost, leaving only whispers behind. The custody terms had changed. Greg's control over Miles was now limited, a reminder that justice could, at last, bend the rules in favor of truth. Julia's eyes met her son's, and Miles's smile was radiant, filled with quiet pride and relief. The years of neglect and doubts seemed to dissolve in that moment, replaced by the unbreakable bond forged through hardship. She knelt down, wrapping her arms around him in a hug that spoke volumes of endurance, forgiveness, and triumph. Later, as the crowd thinned and the bright lights softened, Julia took the microphone at the PTA meeting. Her voice, steady and clear, filled the room with resolve. "I'm not here just for myself, but for every woman who's ever been underestimated or silenced. We deserve to be heard, to be respected. This community can be a place where that happens, if we choose it." Her words rippled through the room, igniting nods and applause. Julia's newfound confidence wasn't just personal victory. It was a beacon, challenging the status quo and calling others to stand taller. As she stepped down, Miles at her side, Julia felt a calm she hadn't known in years. The battle had been fierce, the wounds deep, but healing had begun. She forgave those who doubted her, a kindness born not from weakness, but from grace. Together, mother and son faced a future redefined, not by loss or humiliation, but by courage and integrity. And in that future, Julia knew, both were finally free to thrive. Under the flickering fluorescent light of her cramped living room, Julia sat surrounded by a spread of papers and folders, her fingers trembling as she carefully sifted through each document Miles had bravely brought to her. The house was quiet, except for the soft rustle of paper and the faint buzz of the old refrigerator humming in the kitchen. Her heart pounded with a blend of dread and determination. This was it, the moment that could change everything. The files told a damning story. Line after line of financial records revealed how Greg had manipulated the books, declaring less income than reality, funneling assets into offshore accounts she'd never known existed. The evidence was undeniable, a labyrinth of falsified statements and fabricated expenses that rewrote the truth of his wealth. Julia's usually steady hands shook slightly as she reached for her phone, calling her lawyer with a voice stronger than she felt. "Linda," Julia said, her voice tight but resolute. "I've got something. Real proof. Greg's been hiding money for years. The divorce settlement was based on lies." Linda's gravity-filled pause on the other end was sudden, then firm. "This changes everything. We'll file the motions immediately. The court won't ignore this." Outside, the sleepy town of Santa Rosa moved on unaware. But inside, a storm was about to break. Within days, the tide began to turn. Julia's lawyer presented the evidence, the judge's eyes narrowing as the truth unfurled in the sterile courtroom. Greg, once confident and untouchable, crumbled behind his neatly tailored suit. His once bright smile faded under the weight of his deceit exposed. The supportive whispers of Vanessa, his new girlfriend, faltered too, and she vanished from the community as quickly as she had arrived, her cruel smirk replaced by awkward silence. News spread, first quietly, then with growing momentum, as neighbors who had doubted Julia now watched in astonishment. The town's perception shifted palpably, from cold judgment to cautious respect. Julia herself found a quiet satisfaction in this turn, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the battle was far from over. At home, Miles beamed for the first time in months, his loyalty rewarded in the most tangible way. Julia hugged him close, feeling the tremor of triumph mingled with exhaustion. "We did it," she whispered, tears blurring the edge of her vision. Yet even as justice was served, Julia's victory was not just legal, it was deeply personal. She had reclaimed her dignity, her voice, and her future. As she looked ahead, a quiet question lingered. How many other women silenced by lies might find their own hidden truths? The fight for justice was far-reaching, and Julia knew her story had just begun to inspire. Could the strength born of adversity ripple beyond her small world? She dared to hope, and with Miles by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next.